March 18th, 1944, Bastogne, Belgium. The rain hadn't stopped for 3 days. It drummed against the corrugated roofs of the field workshops like 1,000 restless fingers tapping on tin. The smell of oil, mud, and cordite hung thick in the air, clinging to uniforms and skin alike. Beyond the thin walls, the low rumble of distant artillery rolled like thunder across the Ardennes. To most men, it was just another night on the edge of hell. But for one man, Corporal Walt Keegan, it was the night everything changed. Walt was no soldier of legend. He wasn't the kind of man whose name would echo through history or appear in the bold lines of a medal citation. He was a mechanic, plain, quiet, and stubbornly precise. His hands, calloused from years of fixing tractors back home in Indiana, had touched everything from tank treads to broken rifles. But tonight, those same hands trembled, not from fear, but from frustration. Before him lay the weapon that had become his curse, a sleek experimental rifle, one that the Army had hoped would replace the standard M1 Garand in select units. It looked promising on paper, lighter, faster, more efficient. But in the mud and chaos of war, paper meant nothing. The rifle jammed after every third shot. Every soldier who had tested it cursed its name. Even the ordnance engineers had washed their hands of it, labeling it a field failure. But Walt, he couldn't let it go. He'd been assigned to inspect damaged vehicles that day, but when the others turned in for the night, he stayed behind. The flickering light from a single kerosene lamp illuminated the workbench, casting long shadows across the walls. The rifle lay in pieces, stripped bare, its heart exposed, metal, springs, and failure. Walt stared at it for hours, tracing every curve, every fault line, every screw. Somewhere inside this machine, he believed, was an answer waiting to be found. Outside, a shell burst somewhere to the east. The ground trembled. Dust fell from the rafters. But Walt didn't flinch. His mind was somewhere else, back home maybe. Back in that quiet barn in Indiana where his father had once told him, "There ain't a machine in this world that can't be fixed, boy. You just have to listen to what it's trying to tell you." But this rifle, it wasn't talking. Not yet. He leaned back, rubbing his eyes. His toolbox was nearly empty now. He had tried everything, adjusting the bolt carrier, sanding the feed ramps, cleaning the gas system. Nothing worked. Each attempt had ended the same way. The third round jammed, the cycle failed, the weapon choked. He muttered to himself, cursing under his breath. Then his gaze drifted toward a coil of radio wire hanging from a peg on the wall. Thin, flexible, forgotten. It wasn't meant for weapons, just for communication sets and makeshift repairs. But in that instant, something in his mind sparked. The gas tube. That was it. The pressure wasn't balanced. The system was choking on its own force. Maybe, just maybe, if he could redirect the flow. Walt grabbed the wire, cut a small length, and began twisting it into a loop. His fingers moved fast, almost instinctively. He anchored one end near the chamber and wound the rest through the gas port, rerouting the release of pressure in a way that made no logical sense. It was crude, improvised, something no trained engineer would dare attempt. He reassembled the rifle slowly, every click of metal echoing through the silent workshop. Then he stepped outside into the rain, the cold biting his face, the darkness swallowing him whole. He raised the rifle, aimed at a tree stump 20 yards away, and fired. The first shot cracked through the night air. The second followed. Then the third. No jam. He fired again. 5, 10, 15, 20. Not a single misfire. The rifle sang in his hands, smooth and flawless. The sound echoed across the valley, bouncing off the rain-soaked hills. Walt lowered it slowly, staring at the weapon in disbelief. He'd done it. Against all odds, against every failure and every order to give up, he'd fixed it. But as he stood there, rain dripping from the brim of his helmet, something in him shifted. He wasn't just holding a weapon anymore. He was holding a secret, one that could change everything. Back inside, he sat down, staring at the rifle on the bench. He didn't know whether to laugh or fear what he'd just created. He thought about telling his commanding officer. Then again, maybe not. Maybe they'd just take it away, slap someone else's name on it, and forget him. Like they always did. He wiped his hands, stared into the flickering lamp, and whispered, "Well, let's see if anyone believes me in the morning." The rain outside intensified, washing away footprints, covering the sound of distant guns. Walt leaned back in his chair, exhaustion settling over him, unaware that what he'd just done would echo far beyond that night, or that his name, one day, would vanish from the records entirely. If you're just joining us here on WW2 Frontline Legends, take a moment to subscribe and become part of our growing family of history lovers from all around the world. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from, whether it's the US, the UK, Canada, the Philippines, or anywhere else across the globe. Your support helps us uncover forgotten heroes like Corporal Walt Keegan, the men who shaped history but whose names the world almost forgot. By morning, word had already begun to spread through the camp. Men whispered about the strange noise echoing through the rain the night before. Someone firing a new rifle, one said. Didn't jam once, another claimed. When the workshop doors creaked open, Walt was already awake, his uniform wrinkled, his hands blackened with oil and soot. Captain Miller, his commanding officer, stepped inside with a skeptical look. Heard you were making noise last night, Keegan, he said. You planning to start your own war out here? Walt didn't answer. He simply handed over the rifle. Try it, sir, he said. Miller frowned but took the weapon. He fired once. Then again. Then again. Each shot rang clear. His eyes widened. What the hell did you do? Fixed it, Walt said simply. Within hours, a messenger arrived from Army Ordnance Command. A Major Howard Reese, an inspector overseeing weapon reliability, was in the area conducting field reviews. Miller arranged a demonstration. That afternoon, under a cold gray sky, they gathered in the makeshift firing range behind the barracks. Walt stood silently as the major examined the weapon. Looks like a standard prototype, Reese muttered. Serial number matches one of the test failures. Yes, sir, Miller replied. Except this one doesn't fail. They watched as Reese loaded the rifle, fired, and then paused. He fired again, then emptied the clip without a single jam. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Reese turned to Walt, holding the rifle up. How'd you do it? Walt hesitated. Just a bit of wire, sir. The major blinked. Wire? Radio wire, sir. Rerouted the gas flow. Balanced the chamber pressure. Reese's jaw tightened. You're telling me this rifle works because of a piece of wire? Yes, sir. The major stared at him for a moment longer, then laughed under his breath. Well, I'll be damned. That night, they packed the rifle in a crate and shipped it to England for further testing. Walt watched as the truck carrying it disappeared down the muddy road. He didn't know it then, but that would be the last time he ever saw it. He returned to his duties, fixing broken jeeps, patching engines, and tending to his men's weapons. But something inside him had changed. He'd built something the Army had written off as impossible. Yet he knew deep down that once the higher-ups saw it, his name would vanish. He'd seen it happen before. As the weeks passed, rumors began circulating. Engineers in London were studying a field-adjusted rifle that outperformed every other model. No one mentioned his name, but Walt heard whispers through the grapevine. They're calling it a miracle weapon, one soldier said. Some new design breakthrough. Walt smiled faintly. Ain't that something, he muttered. He returned to his bench, the oil lamp flickering once more. He still had the spool of radio wire sitting beside him, a small, rusting reminder of the night he changed everything. And somewhere, across the English Channel, a group of engineers stared in disbelief at the modification that no one could explain. April 2nd, 1944, Ordnance Testing Range, Enfield, England. The wind swept cold and bitter across the English countryside, rattling the corrugated roofs of the Enfield testing grounds. Rows of rifles gleamed under the pale morning light, each tagged, numbered, and documented. Engineers in gray coats moved briskly between firing lanes, their clipboards damp from the mist. Somewhere among the endless paperwork, buried between reports of failed bolts and cracked chambers, sat one unmarked crate stamped simply, Field Modification Bastogne. Inside that crate lay Corporal Walt Keegan's rifle. When the technicians pried it open, they found what looked like a mistake. A rough, hand-twisted loop of copper radio wire ran through the gas tube, something that should never have passed inspection. But when the range officer ordered a test, the results silenced the range. Every shot fired clean. No stoppages. No carbon fouling. The cycle was perfect. The chief engineer, Colonel Richard Farnsworth, watched from behind the firing glass. A veteran of the First World War, Farnsworth had seen every weapon design the Army could produce. But this was different. Who authorized this design? He asked, his voice gravelly with disbelief. No one, sir, replied an aide. It was found in a field repair unit, labeled as a field adjustment. Farnsworth leaned closer to the viewing pane. Then whoever made it, he said quietly, Just solved a problem that's been plaguing us for 3 years. By noon, telegrams had already begun to circulate between Enfield and Washington. The Americans wanted details. The British wanted blueprints. The rifle was stripped down, every component measured, photographed, and catalogued. The strange wire loop, improvised, ugly, yet brilliant, became the subject of intense debate. "Impossible," said one engineer. "Accidental," said another. But when they rebuilt the rifle from scratch without the wire, it jammed again after 3 rounds. When they added it back, it ran flawlessly. That night, under the dim lights of the Enfield drafting room, Farnsworth sketched the modified gas system onto blueprint paper. He labeled it Keegan Loop, Field Prototype. He didn't know who Keegan was, but the name had appeared on the crate manifest, scribbled hastily in pencil. For weeks, tests continued. Different materials, chamber pressures, and configurations, all derived from that one forgotten rifle. The loop became more than a fix, it was a breakthrough. The design offered stability at high rates of fire without overpressurizing the system, a balance that weapons engineers had failed to perfect under combat stress. By early May, the report reached Washington. The Ordnance Department requested the prototype be shipped home for further technical evaluation. Farnsworth protested, fearing the discovery would vanish into bureaucracy. But the order was final. The rifle left England under military escort. And just like that, Walt Keegan's invention disappeared into the fog of war. Back in Bastogne, Walt never received a word. He assumed the rifle had been scrapped like the others. His days fell into routine again, repairing jeeps, replacing tank tracks, and scavenging parts from destroyed German vehicles. Yet some nights, when the rain returned, he'd glance toward that same workbench and wonder. He wasn't the kind of man to boast, but part of him hoped that somewhere, someone noticed what he'd done. He never imagined that his creation had crossed the channel, or that his name, penciled onto the manifest, was about to vanish from it. In late June, the Ordnance Board met in Washington, D.C. to review the Bastogne field modification. Around the table sat a dozen men in crisp uniforms and tailored suits. None of them had ever been near a battlefield. They discussed pressures, metallurgy, and ballistics, never once mentioning the name of the mechanic who'd made it all possible. By the end of the meeting, the decision was unanimous. The modification would be standardized for post-war rifle research. The origin would be listed as anonymous field development. Somewhere in an archive clerk's office, the name Corporal Walt Keegan was erased with a single stroke of a pen. Months later, the prototype resurfaced at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland. There, under the hot summer sun, it was tested again, this time under official supervision. The results mirrored Enfield's findings. One engineer described it as a mechanical revelation, another as a battlefield miracle. The Army ordered additional prototypes built for comparison. But Walt would never know. In Bastogne, he was transferred to a different unit after his shop was shelled. He never spoke of the rifle again. To his fellow mechanics, he was just another grease-covered soldier doing his job. But some nights, under the dim light of his bunk lamp, he'd catch himself thinking about that wire loop. He still had a small coil of it tucked into his kit bag, a piece of radio cable, frayed and copper-colored, his silent signature. Meanwhile, in England, Farnsworth had his own doubts. The rifle he'd tested was gone, but its ghost lingered. Engineers at Enfield began designing their own prototypes based on his notes. Word spread through quiet corridors and encrypted cables. An American mechanic had discovered a pressure-balancing mechanism that could revolutionize automatic weapons. The British tried adapting the idea to their EM-2 rifle, but their materials couldn't replicate the performance. They assumed the Americans had withheld key data. In truth, there was no data, just one man's instinct. CT. By early 1945, the Allies were pushing deep into Germany. In the ruins of Aachen, a team of German weapons engineers from Mauser-Werke stumbled upon a captured Allied rifle, one that bore a strange internal loop. They disassembled it, studied it, and documented the modification. Their notes later surfaced in declassified files decades later, marked simply, "Unknown Gas Adjustment Method, Origin American." They tried to reproduce it in the STG-45M project, but the metallurgy failed under sustained fire. The German engineer overseeing the test reportedly muttered, "Whoever made this understood war better than science." Back in Washington, the design quietly evolved. Post-war committees studying small arms efficiency reviewed it again, merging its principles into early gas-operated prototypes. One of these experiments would directly influence the development of the FN FAL rifle years later, a weapon so reliable and versatile it became known as the right arm of the free world. Yet, even in those technical papers and design patents, there was no mention of the man from Indiana who started it all. In 1946, months after the war's end, a crate arrived at Fort Benning, Georgia, marked obsolete ordnance. Inside were several broken prototypes, rifles that never made it past testing. Among them was one with faint etchings near the stock, almost worn away by time and grime. A technician, bored and curious, sanded the metal lightly. There, beneath layers of paint, 3 letters appeared. KL. No one knew what they meant. The rifle was catalogued, stored, and forgotten again. Years later, when historians stumbled upon a reference to the Keegan loop in Enfield's wartime archives, they tried to trace it. The U.S. Army denied any knowledge. Farnsworth had long retired. The documentation trail ended abruptly in mid-1944. And somewhere, far from the paper trails and blueprints, Walt Keegan was discharged and sent home. Indiana greeted him with silence. No parades, no medals, just an empty barn, rusted tools, and a father's old words echoing in his mind. There ain't a machine in this world that can't be fixed. He set the small coil of radio wire on his workbench and went back to repairing farm equipment. The war had ended, but the story of his creation had barely begun. He never knew that his forgotten fix, born out of rain, desperation, and stubborn faith, had crossed oceans, influenced nations, and helped shape one of the most iconic rifles in history. Somewhere in the shadows of time, his legacy was taking root. But no one would ever tell him. And yet, history has a strange way of remembering what it tries to forget. June 17, 1963, London, England. The archive room at the old Enfield Armory was colder than usual that morning. Dust hung in the air like fog, and the faint hum of fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. A young British historian named Thomas Elwood sat surrounded by stacks of wartime documents, most of them forgotten technical reports from the 1940s. His assignment was simple: catalog and used small arms blueprints for transfer to the National Archives. But buried between a bundle of faded telegrams and weapons reports, he found something that didn't belong there, a yellowing folder marked Keegan Loop, Field Prototype, Bastogne. He frowned. The name meant nothing to him. But the moment he flipped the folder open, the story began to breathe again. Inside were sketches, firing data, and one faint photograph, a mechanic in oil-stained fatigues, standing beside a workbench, face half-turned from the camera. The caption underneath read, "Unidentified U.S. Ordnance Technician, March 1944. Elwood leaned closer. The expression on the man's face told a story, determined, exhausted, focused. Whoever he wasn't posing for glory. He was working. Attached to the photograph was a single sheet of paper signed by Colonel Richard Farnsworth, the same engineer who had supervised the Enfield tests nearly 20 years earlier. The note was brief. The Bastogne modification remains the most remarkable field innovation of this war. It demonstrates that necessity and courage can outthink entire design bureaus. We never located the creator. I suspect he never wanted to be found. Elwood read that line 3 times. Never located the creator. It struck him as odd. How could the man responsible for such a breakthrough simply vanish from record? He looked closer at the blueprint, tracing the pencil strokes. The lines were rough, human, not the polished drafts of a weapons designer. Scrawled in one corner, barely visible under layers of pencil and eraser marks, were 3 small letters, WK. Elwood sat back in his chair, the realization dawning slowly. Whoever Keegan was, he had left his initials hidden inside the drawing, almost as if he wanted to be remembered, but only by those who looked closely enough. He took a deep breath. "Who were you, Walt Keegan?" he whispered. A few months later, Elwood's curiosity led him to the U.S. National Archives in Maryland. He spent days combing through Ordnance Department records, searching for any mention of the name. It was as if someone had deliberately erased it. The official reports referred only to anonymous field adjustment, Bastogne Sector, 1944. But one faded manifest caught his attention. A shipment record from Belgium to Enfield, dated March 20th, 1944. Under origin, someone had written Corporal W. Keegan. The handwriting matched the one on the Enfield blueprint. That was all the proof he needed. He wrote an article about the discovery for a small British historical journal titled Forgotten Frontlines. It was published quietly in the fall of 1964 under the headline, "The Mechanic Who Changed Military History." The piece received little attention at first, but among a handful of historians, it sparked quiet fascination. They began connecting dots across archives and technical papers. The gas system design from the Bastogne rifle had influenced the early concepts behind the FN FAL, verified through overlapping pressure diagrams and test reports. The Keegan loop, as Farnsworth had called it, wasn't just a lucky field repair. It was the missing link between wartime improvisation and post-war innovation. The irony was cruel. The man who had changed the future of infantry weapons had never known it. June 1965, Indiana, USA. The cicadas were loud that summer. Walt Keegan sat on his porch, watching the sun drop behind the cornfields. His hair was gray now, his hands still strong but slower. The war felt like another lifetime. He hadn't touched a rifle in 20 years. Most of his neighbors didn't even know he'd served. His mailbox rattled as the postman's truck pulled away. Inside was a brown envelope, postmarked London. Walt tore it open, frowning at the unfamiliar stationery. Inside was a letter. "Dear Mr. Keegan, my name is Thomas Elwood. I am a military historian with the Enfield Archive in London. During my research, I came across a reference to a modification you performed in March 1944, something called the Keegan loop. It appears your innovation played a key role in the development of later small-arms systems, including the FAL rifle. I would be honored to speak with you if possible. Sincerely, Thomas Elwood." Walt read it twice, his brow furrowed. Then he laughed quietly. "So they finally found me," he muttered. He placed the letter on the table beside his coffee mug. For a long time, he stared at it, torn between pride and disbelief. He hadn't thought about that rifle in decades. The war had ended. Life had moved on. But deep down, some part of him had always wondered if that rainy night in Bastogne had mattered at all. Now he had his answer. Weeks later, a British journalist arrived in Indiana to interview him. The conversation lasted hours. Walt recounted the rain, the broken rifle, the wire, the test. He even showed the reporter the small coil of radio wire he'd kept all those years, tarnished but intact. When the story was published, it spread far beyond the journal. Newspapers across Europe reprinted excerpts under headlines like, "The Forgotten Mechanic Who Fixed History." But Walt never sought fame. When a weapons manufacturer offered to fly him to Belgium to see the old workshop, he declined. "Let the past stay where it is," he said softly. Still, the story took on a life of its own. Military museums began referencing the Keegan loop. Engineers studying historical gas systems cited his work. And when the FN FAL was officially recognized as the most widely used battle rifle of the Cold War, one line in a technical report quietly acknowledged. The pressure-stabilized chamber design traces conceptual origin to a 1944 American field modification. That was all the credit he would ever get. But for Walt, it was enough. December 1971, Bastogne, Belgium. Snow covered the ruins of what had once been the field workshop. The roof had collapsed. The walls were half buried under vines and ice. A local farmer, digging near the edge of the property, uncovered something metallic, a rusted rifle barrel, twisted and fused with mud. The serial number was faint but legible. Military historians later confirmed it matched the Enfield shipment record from 1944. It was Walt's rifle. The weapon was restored and placed on display at the Bastogne War Museum. The plaque beneath it read, "Experimental Field Rifle, 1944, modified by U.S. mechanic Corporal Walt Keegan." His innovation helped shape modern infantry design. True courage often goes unseen. For decades, visitors passed that exhibit without realizing how close history came to forgetting him entirely. History is built on the names we remember, and the ones we don't. Walt Keegan never commanded troops, never stormed beaches, never raised a flag over victory. But in the quiet chaos of a Belgian workshop, he changed the rhythm of modern warfare with nothing more than wire, patience, and faith that machines could talk, if you knew how to listen. His story is a reminder that not all legends wear medals. Some leave behind only fingerprints on cold steel, sketches on yellow paper, and the faint echo of a rifle that fired 20 rounds straight through the rain. And maybe, somewhere out there, in the fields of Bastogne, the ghosts of that night still linger. The steady rhythm of shots echoing through the mist, a mechanic's quiet triumph reborn with every pull of the trigger. If stories like this remind you that courage doesn't always happen on the battlefield, but sometimes in a muddy workshop under flickering lamplight. Then make sure you're part of our growing community here at WW2 Frontline Legends. Hit subscribe right now to keep these forgotten heroes alive and let their stories echo beyond time. And before you go, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Whether it's London, Sydney, New York, or right there in Indiana, your words keep this channel marching forward. Please like, share, and subscribe to WW2 Frontline Legends, because together we're keeping history alive, one story at a time.